We are in the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art at the University of Oregon with Latin American Studies curator Cheryl Hartop, who's going to guide us through the museum and show us one of the temporary exhibits and some other art. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here and welcome to the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. We were founded back in 1929, so some of the artwork that you're going to see in the Mexican print show is from that very same period. We were founded predominantly as a museum of Asian art, but our collection has since grown to encompass works from Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, the United States, and from really, going back centuries to the present day. So welcome, glad you're here, and I'm going to show you an exhibition that was recently curated in collaboration with the Portland Art Museum. So why don't we go on upstairs and take a look.
Okay. This is the famous courtyard as well, right here, right, with the fountain. But it's all locked down because of the pandemic, of course.
We have about 450 objects now that have been acquired since around 2008.
That's terrific. And the storage is all here on site?
Yes. Yeah. So I want to mention just a couple connections with University of Oregon with this exhibition. Portland Art Museum's collection of about 150 Mexican prints. Many of those works were acquired from a gentleman who's a University of Oregon graduate. So you're going to see works from the collection of Gordon Gilkey, who graduated from UO in 1936, and he met folks like Jose Clemente Orozco, and he was a big fan of printmaking in Mexico in the first half of the 20th century. The other connection that I like to do, and we really encourage this here at the museum, is for us to work with faculty and students on exhibitions. So I reached out to Wendy Echeverria Garcia, who's a second-year student at University of Oregon, and she's a Latin American Studies major, as well as Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies major. So she and I worked together on the show, selecting the works. She wrote some labels, and she also participated in some wonderful virtual public programs too.
That's terrific.
So we have about 62 prints that we selected from Portland Art Museum's collection, but they didn't have everything we wanted. So we reached out to Seattle Art Museum and a couple of private collectors in the area. And I also want to mention that the special collections at UO Libraries, in Knight Library, has a wonderful, small, but really important collection of posters from the Taller de Grafica Popular. So we're both the museum and special collections, we're trying to build our collection, so we have a lot to share with students. One of the things Professor Garcia Caro and I spoke about was to focus on a few objects in the exhibition that address land rights and land reform. So I'm going to take us through to 3 works and then maybe end with another special print by David Alfaro Siqueiros that inspired the title of the show. Mm-hmm. So it's called Nuestra Imagen Actual, and our thinking behind that was to get people to question, are these images and the messages that they convey still relevant to our current times? So we might want to start here with this wonderful 1932 print by Diego Rivera called Zapata. It's probably one of the most important prints of the 20th century. He did these 4 prints and one other in 1932 in New York City. And they were the second group of lithographs he made and the last group. But you can tell he was just a master draftsman. He's drawing on a lithographic stone with a waxy crayon. So you see like every little delicate line in the works. And each one is based on a detail from one of his murals in Mexico. So this one on Zapata is referencing a section of a mural at the Palacio de Cortez in Cuernavaca. And he painted that mural 1929 to 1930, and it was commissioned by the United States ambassador to Mexico at the time, Dwight Morrow. In it, you see 12 years later, he's still referencing one of the great revolutionary leaders, Emiliano Zapata, here in white, who's leading a group of campesinos, a very kind of diagonal, dynamic motion. So, you feel like the movement is progressing. And he was fighting for land reform. He started the Liberation Army of the South with peasants who worked on sugarcane cutting and also in the fields. So you see the machete here and these farming implements that they're holding as weapons. And he wrote the Plan de Ayala in 1911, demanding that the government take 1/3 of the land away from the rich and give it to the poor. So he's not dressed, interestingly enough, as he usually looked, but rather he's dressed all in white, almost like a martyr or Christ-like figure, and mirroring the clothing that his supporters are wearing. He unfortunately died in 1919 because of internal differences. And you see him here trampling a figure at the bottom. You almost don't notice it. I think it's very, our eye is really drawn to the white horse and the white figure. But if you look here really closely at the bottom, you see a fallen conquistador because of the sword. So with that symbolic addition to the work, he's kind of conflating these two times and emphasizing we're going to build our new country on our indigenous past and present, and not on the colonizers, not on Europe.
You mentioned the sickle in his hand. Do you think, of course, Diego Rivera was a member of the Communist Party. Do you think he's writing onto Zapata the symbology of anarchism or communism and embedding it within the engraving to some degree?
I do. I think he, yes, definitely knows how to use a very powerful symbol in his work that can have a double meaning. So definitely, he was kind of in and out of the Communist Party, but at that point, even though he was much criticized for being supported by families like the Rockefellers in New York City when he was producing this work. At the same time, of course, we remember that in his famous mural at Rockefeller Center, he included Lenin, and that's why this mural was destroyed. So definitely he's inserting references to the Communist Party to, stay true to his values and ideals, that art should be in the service of the people and to promote social change.
This is wonderful. And you mentioned that the print is created on a stone. It's a lithograph. Do we know how many prints came out of that same one, or was there a?
So typically when you make a print, you see that things look backwards, right? His signature here, DR, which was actually on the lithographic stone, because it's like a reverse image once you print it. But you see his signature there, and then you also see 32, but backwards. But once the edition is printed, and here the edition was 100, and then it says number 37, he signed it and dated it again, but here you see 37 out of 100. And again, the DR 32 on the book. So.
Which refers to the year, right? The
yes,
year 32.
yeah, 1932.
And this is also the case, right, in the
yes.
Zapata.
Yeah, this is actually number 37 out of 100. So the total edition was 100, and these actually are from Seattle Art Museum.
They are, I just noticed it, right? So they're usually in their archives, or
yes.
they go off to other exhibits, and you're part of that larger Northwestern network of
yes.
depositories where you can draw from other.
You see that the lights are really low in this gallery, and we have to do that to, paper fades over time, so we have to keep things low, and then once, only have them on view for a certain amount of time, and then once they're returned to the museum, they have to rest. Maybe this is work number 2, and I installed it here because I wanted to contrast this printmaking technique, which is linoleum cut, to the lithography. So here you can see very different type of line and form and mark making in it. What's happening is, almost like linoleum flooring. The artist will take a chisel into that material, which is soft, and everything that remains then is inked. The raised surface is inked. So all the black lines are raised, and then the artist, Fanny Rebel, gouged in and took out all the white areas. So you see it's more jagged, it's more, I think it really emphasizes also the subject of this work, la sequía, or the drought. So just that act of cutting into a surface, and these jagged lines that you see all around her, talk about anguish, grief, despair, harshness, of life. But in the midst of that, in the midst of this, dying stalk that she's holding, you also see strength and endurance and resistance too. Fanny Rebel was, the Mexican mural movement embraced artists from other countries who came to Mexico fleeing from Nazi Germany, and she's an example of that. Her real name was Fanny Rabinovich. So she came to Mexico, started studying art, worked with Rivera on murals, and started painting some of her own murals. I like how she focuses, on the figure here, which is really, even takes up more space than Zapata does in Rivera's print. And you just see in the back like these electrical power lines that signal, modernism and development and, encroachment on the land. She's very much saying we need to talk about water rights, we need to talk about land reform. And this work was done much later. This is from 1955. So these themes, land, labor, and education reform, which were fought for during the revolution, continued for decades afterwards.
The linoleum itself is widely recognized as an industrial byproduct. So it is quite interesting, at least from my point of view, that in the 1950s artists are using industrial byproducts as the base for the production of a kind of mechanical form of art, which is in itself, of course, the print making, right? So they're going to make several prints, not fully mechanized, because it's not a machine making the prints, right? It's not a printer. But the base itself is not a stone or is no longer wood as it used to be with serigraphy and lithography, etc. But it's linotype. Yeah, I find that extremely interesting and innovative. I mean, they must have thought that they were doing something quite radical with the product with which they were, not the product, but the means by which they were achieving their.
And you bring up a good point, because one of the reasons why printmaking flourished, even more than the mural movement, was because it was, in terms of this linoleum cut, inexpensive to produce. That's why you see no color in this show, really. It was just black ink on a piece of paper. And, artists working in collectives, so they didn't have to buy all the presses and the equipment. They could go somewhere and pay some dues to work in this workshop. But she was part of the Taller de Grafica Popular, and they were easy to distribute. You could, put them up all over town on trains, slide something under a doorway, pass them out at a union meeting. They were very versatile, more so than murals.
The murals, of course, that need a large former colonial palace to be painted.
Yes.
And for many years, right? I mean, murals took years and years to complete and a lot of material.
Yeah. Yes, the fresco technique. Yeah.
So the taller itself was based in Mexico City?
Yeah. Maybe I'll end with this work and we can, select a few more works to briefly comment on. But Leopoldo Mendez, the artist who made this print, he was one of the founders of the Taller de Grafica Popular. It was in Mexico City, 1937 it was founded. It wasn't the first printmakers collective. There were a few before that. But it was one that lasted for decades, maybe even up until this day. And it had international appeal. So artists like Leopoldo Mendez, when you see here, he's definitely addressing, again, the hacendado who's going to pay you whatever he feels like paying you for the corn that you have produced on his land. Is very threatening, like a bully. The Taller also made prints for addressing fascism in Europe and the Spanish Civil War too. And even, human rights abuses in Guatemala. They invited artists from all over the world to come and make prints in Mexico City, and many artists from the US went too. And then they also, traveled, and it was, a really great moment, and that's what the exhibition tries to capture. Talking about murals and prints, this kind of does both, because Mendez was friends with some of the folks involved in the movie industry in Mexico City in the 30s to the 60s is like the golden age of cinema. And one of the directors, Emilio Fernandez, who was quite famous at the time, he made a film in 1948, Pueblerina, and he asked Mendez to watch the film and then do some, again, I think this Yeah, this is another linoleum cut print from the 40s. To make some images, and then he ran those with the introductory credits for the film. So you go to the cinema and you would see this blown up huge on the screen as kind of a harbinger of what, you know, the movie was about. So Mendez is, you know, just one of these figures that dedicated his entire life to printmaking and to the taller de Grafica Popular, and also he really believed, like the majority of the artists in this show, that art is for a social purpose. And its value is in its social utility, not in because it's an object, a commodity that could be sold.
Of course, and one of the interesting elements of the period that we're looking at is that this art was a byproduct of the Mexican Revolution that had already happened in the 10s and 20s, right? It started in 1910 and pretty much completed with the Constitution of 1917, but of course ongoing well into the 30s, right?
Yes.
All the way to land reform and nationalizations. So it's as if art was part of the larger political debate that was still ongoing, not only in Mexico, but in the larger West, between social reform, revolutionary socialism, anarchism, and of course Nazi
Yes.
and fascist corporate takeover of socialization and of the state itself, right? And so they're using art in ways that are very local, but at the same time speak to other countries, as you were saying. Where would they be distributed? Would they be in newspapers? I mean, you just mentioned film, so it's very versatile.
Yeah, here's a poster in honor of Lázaro Cárdenas. And so they would do posters. They would do, you know, honoring certain, you know, events. Many addressing the literacy campaign, union activities, which were very big during Cárdenas's presidency. They would also do like little pamphlets, you know,
Right, pamphlets, yeah.
the pamphlets to distribute. But then, you know, after Cárdenas's presidency and things started swinging in the more conservative direction, they had to rethink what they were, you know, doing as a source of income, since they wouldn't have a lot of government funding for their printing projects. So they started doing works like for artist books, portfolios, and selling them to libraries and museums and collectors. And that took place during the 40s and 50s, and it was very successful because the quality was so good. And, you know, museums and collectors and libraries were very happy to have these prints to use as a teaching tool.
It's also incredibly important to see, and we see this in the poster Homenaje a Cárdenas, that this is a period after the revolution in which Mexico is embracing a more social form of industrialization, no longer the industrialization around export of goods out of Mexico with the train system, of course, that
Right.
Porfirio Diaz had created to ship everything out. But in fact, we're talking here about factories that are producing probably food byproducts for the people. This is a hydroelectric dam, very likely.
Yes.
So to produce local electricity for every household, which was one of the proud achievements of the Mexican Revolution, and so on. And interestingly, of course, is the fact that this non-bourgeois form of art is an art that, as you were saying, is cheap, is accessible. Mm-hmm. People can have this art and take it home with them. Everyone can hang it in their households and all of a sudden decorate their newly electrified house with a piece of art that has been also somehow mechanically reproduced, and yet
Yes.
it still has the touch of an incredibly detailed artist. As you were saying, that they were terrific detailed artists. Here's another scene, probably from Mexico
Yeah.
City, right? An elevated pass.
Yeah, this was the
This is
first
the railway.
elevated pass built in Mexico City.
Right.
And you see, again, you gotta like zero in, but you see the
Right.
train tracks there, right? So
Yes.
at one point, a train was passing,
Right.
you know, underneath with all the cars, you know,
Mhm.
above. And then this figure here, kind of with these antiquities, you know, of a bygone era that he's peddling.
Right.
But you still see, you know, this is not the answer. Moving to the city, modernization, it's a big question. Are people better off?
That is a very recurrent theme of the 40s and 50s, right? Whether the revolution had itself failed in its promise to
Yes.
create a more balanced and a more democratic and a more just society, right? And it clearly starts to see the deprivation of many people, how people have been unable to really get their children out of the cycle of poverty,
Yes.
and how there is an emerging new industrial class, right?
This is the print that
It's very
inspired
famous,
the title of the show, Nuestra Imagen Actual by Siqueiros. You see how he works with foreshortening, so these hands are just enormous, and they're tied there, and the face is bound, and so especially, you know, while we were working on this show, this idea of suffocation, of
Masking.
yes, masking.
Right.
I mean, all of
being
these.
tied up,
Yeah.
locked down. That's a good reference to the current moment in which we live too, yeah.
Yeah, with the death of George Floyd. I mean, so
Right,
many.
of
like,
course, there is that as well.
Um,
I can't breathe, man.
yeah,
Yes.
layers to it. So this work, yeah, definitely touches on, or is a very direct image. You see that. One thing I didn't mention was say, right after the revolution, 72% of the population was illiterate. So the imagery here, you're not going to see much abstraction or things that, you know, you kind of have to look really hard to figure out what the message is. It's going to be bold, right, in your face, direct, very straightforward. This is about torture and subjugation.
Yeah, how to tell a revolutionary from a counter-revolutionary
Yes.
is always a very tricky question, right? And fascism seems to have co-opted forms, both aesthetic and political, that belonged to socialism and communism at the time. It was a form of fake news, as it is today, right?
Yes.
So it's a form of populism, of saying we're here to deliver the people from hunger and so on, and yet their agenda was more about marching orders for the proletariat to put them to work for the corporate elites still, right? So it's not unlike what the billionaires that might be supporting forms of fascist populism today in this
Yes.
country and in other countries have been up to, right, for the last 10, 20 years.
This poster here is kind of interesting. I read something recently about it where it kind of speaks to the types of negotiations that were going on, right? We would not normally see these two figures in, you know, Mexican prints, but definitely these two figures, right? The factory worker and the farm worker. But it was talking about how people were trying to build these alliances to combat fascism, but they had to include, you know, the executive in the office, as well as the military person. But
The professional,
Yes.
the lawyer or the teacher, the people who wear a saco, right? A jacket or a blazer and a tie were part of this alliance. This is part of the context of the of what in Europe was called the Front Populaire, right?
Oh,
The
yes.
Popular Front, right?
Yes.
In which the sort of middle classes would lock arms, as they're doing in this drawing, with the working class to defend the common ground of democracy for as many people as possible versus this notion of authoritarian fascism.
Yeah, I wish they would have included a woman, but...
Of course, there is that. Yes. It's very masculinist art, except for some of the prints that we have seen, but there is...
I know, it was hard to... I mean, women, of course, were very present in the Taller de Grafica Popular. And one woman, you know, was responsible for documenting everything they did, photographing it, keeping all the records, you know, so that's how we know about the Taller.
Right.
You know, sometimes the same thing happens like with the, you know, during the civil rights movement. The women were organizing the protests, but the men have the signs, you know,
Right.
I am a man and are marching, you know, but the women are, kind of on the central, but depicted on the margins. We're not seen.
Or not even seen. That's very unfortunate. Was Frida Kahlo at any point involved in the taller or in printmaking?
We have an image of Frida Kahlo up here. But she taught Fanny Rebel, who did the drought. Yeah. And so she had a small group of students with her, and there was a lot of talk about popular arts, you know, breaking down these hierarchies of what is fine art, what is popular art, painting murals on a bar, right? The corner bar rather than in a government building. So she, you know, definitely instilled in students as well as, you know, just whoever she came in contact with, her love also of indigenous culture in Mexico. Kind of focused mostly on more socio-political imagery in the show group. And what's great about this book, and we scanned it all, and I wanted, you know, it to be on an iPad here, and people, but you know, no touch and things like that with COVID. But anyway, it's bilingual, but bilingual was Mayan, Quiche, Yucatecan Quiche,
right.
and Spanish. So Juan de la Cabala, like many of these artists, went out to very isolated rural places throughout the country and started documenting through their art or through their writing, you know, or recordings, listening to music, language, cultural traditions, ceremonies, things of that nature. And there's a huge fluorescence of that in Mexico at the time. Because really, like, excavations were going on then,
right.
So people were seeing murals from the Mayan civilization being unearthed for the first time, you know. And so that was inspiring their use of color and form in their murals, or the stonework, you know. Underpinnings of several of these works were sometimes images of the soldadera stands in for the actual women who fought in the revolution. Right. You know, that sometimes these kind of romanticized views are what we have left rather than the names or the actual histories, you know, of people too.
Symbol of Mexican syncretism, right, between indigenous and Catholic beliefs, right? Tonantzin and the Virgin Mary.
This is woodcut,
woodcut.
Tamayo. Tamayo we haven't
Tamayo's
mentioned,
amazing, yeah.
but he was actually one of the earliest artists to, start making prints, both for, for a U.S. audience. Before Rivera, Orozco, Tamayo's work is some of the earliest in the show from, 30, 31.
This is great. Thank you, Cheryl.